If there was one specific body part that you could lose fat from, where would it be? If you're like most people, you're probably going to say the stomach or thighs. Targeting these specific areas when losing fat is known as spot reduction. Spot reduction is exercising in such a manner to increase fat loss from a certain spot. Doing crunches to lose stomach fat is probably the most common practice. Unfortunately, this is nothing more than a dream, or is it? As with most things, there's a lot of nuance to dig through when answering this topic. Recently, there's been evidence that suggests it might just be a dream that can come true. While we can't say it will work, we won't say it won't work with what we know now. This video will investigate the nuance. Losing body fat in a specific spot has long been one of the hot topics in the fitness world. Does it happen? Is it possible? Well, there's plenty of products and programs that say it can. However, most professionals will tell you it can't. Perhaps the simplest way to think about it is to answer this question. Did you choose where you gained weight? As the pounds were piling on, were you able to guide some to your thighs, and then some to your belly, and then your neck? Of course not. No one ever asks if they can choose where they store fat, so why would we then ask if we can choose where we lose fat? When trying to guess where you will lose fat first, it's likely the place you gained it most recently. In other words, people will generally lose weight in the reverse order of where they gained it. This order is largely dependent on a person's individual genetics. For example, if your genetics make it easier to gain fat around the stomach as you gain weight, this will be the hardest place for you to lose weight. However, what makes losing fat from the abdominal region so difficult is actually the key to the possibility of spot reduction. We'll get into that later in the video. So how big of an effect does genetics play? Well, it's estimated that genetics is the primary variable that controls fat distribution, up to 60% to be exact. In addition, certain genetic mutations dictate where you store fat as well. For example, Cushing's syndrome causes high fatty deposits in the midsection face between the shoulders and upper back. Things like your sex also play a major role in where you store fat. Women tend to have higher fat deposits in the lower body, such as the thighs and glutes. In contrast, men tend to hold weight around the midsection significantly more than women. Actually, stubborn belly fat may be the key to spot reduction. We'll get into that later on in the video. But back to genetics. If genetics play such a major role, how can we even attempt spot reduction? Well, this is just one of the reasons why most will simply say it's wishful thinking. Merely asking about it immediately brands you as either a beginner or a scammer. However, is this an appropriate reaction? Not really. In reality, the idea isn't that crazy. In fact, the possibility of spot reduction has been put forward by many throughout the past. For example, Ancel Keys, the father of the Mediterranean diet, was a proponent of spot reduction, or at least the possibility of it. It's been noted by various leaders in the field of fitness that athletes tend to burn more fat in the body parts they use more. We're not saying this makes it true, rather we are simply suggesting that it's not as silly of an idea as you may first think. Now, before we go further with the theory of how fat loss occurs and how spot reduction might occur, let's first look at how fat is stored in the first place. When a person consumes food, the body will store the excess calories in of your two storages of energy. The first energy storage is in the form of glycogen, a form of glucose that's stored in your liver and muscles. In a fed state, this glycogen will come from your consumption of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are simply long chains of sugars, making it incredibly simple for the body to put it down into glycogen, a simple sugar. However, your glycogen stores are finite. Therefore, when they're full, they're full. This is why you have a second form of energy storage, your fat stores. Unlike your glycogen stores, your fat stores are almost unlimited, making it the largest amount of energy in your body. There's virtually no limit to it, which is what leads to obesity. The first obvious source of stored fat is from eating fats themselves. When you consume fats, these fats are broken down into triglycerides, which are then shuttled into your fat cells to be used upon later when energy is in demand. At the same time, if you continue eating carbohydrates when your glycogen stores are full, they can be converted into triglycerides to be stored as well. This is how eating too many carbs can make you fat. So now your glycogen stores are full and you have plenty of fat, both waiting to be used for energy. Pay attention to this next part as it will be important later on in the video. When the demand arises, your body will draw from both your glycogen stores as well as your fat stores to different degrees. When your glycogen stores are full, the body will draw from there, as converting glycogen to glucose is a one-step process. However, during times of prolonged exercise or fasting, the body will turn to your fat stores to a higher degree to ration the remaining glycogen, which is needed to power your brain. The triglycerides that were stored in the fat cells are released and go through a process known as gluconeogenesis. which converts the fats into usable glucose. This process produces leftover hydrogen and water as byproducts, which are then exhaled or expelled in fluid. If you stay in a caloric deficit, these stores will remain empty as there's no energy to refill them, and you lose weight. So let's back up for just a second to the part that triglycerides are released. This is where spot reduction comes into play. The primary thought is that fats are to be used through whole body release. The release of fats for energy is taken from the entire body, regardless of what body part is requiring the energy. Fat from your thighs will supply the same amount of energy as fat from your stomach. In other words, from an energy perspective, the body gets no benefit from drawing fat from a specific spot. Spot reduction says you can choose a specific spot to lose fat from. Even though this theory is scoffed at by many, there is actually a sound theory behind it. Proponents of its possibility suggest that spot reduction might work by training a muscle that's near the desired area of fat loss. This could occur by increasing the temperature near the area and increasing blood flow, which may promote lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat. So what does increased blood flow have to do with fat loss? Remember when we spoke about your fat cells holding triglycerides and will release them upon necessity to be used for energy? Well, the interesting thing is these fats aren't soluble in water the slightest. Therefore, their transport to and from tissue requires specialized transport mechanisms and adequate blood flow. In other words, poor blood flow will result in less mobilization of fat stores. On the contrary, more blood flow will increase the ability for fats to mobilize. Remember at the beginning of the video when we talked about belly fat? One of the reasons that makes belly fat so hard to get rid of is the abdominal region experiences significantly less blood flow when compared to other body parts, such as your arms and legs. We do know that certain tactics can increase fat lipolysis in general. For example, taking caffeine has been shown to blunt the use of carbs for energy while promoting the use of fats. However, the mobilization of fats occurs in a more generalized manner rather than specific area. In addition, there is some evidence that certain topical creams do actually work, specifically a cream using a compound known as aminophyllene. Aminophyllene works by lowering the lipolytic threshold. Basically, it makes the breakdown of fats easier to do. For example, a study looked at the effects that aminophyllene cream had on the waist circumference of 50 men and women that were classified as overweight. The researchers reported a significant reduction in waist circumference compared to the placebo group with no adverse events in either group. While working through different mechanisms, aminophyllene still works by increasing the ease of fat breakdown. It seems this is one of the keys for spot reduction. While the body will release fat from everywhere, it will favor the path of least resistance. The primary way spot reduction has been attempted in the past is to perform extra resistance training in the desired area or body part. The best example is using crunches in an attempt to lose fat in the abdominal region. In fact, this is such a common tactic that there has been research to look at its effectiveness or lack thereof. One such study had 40 overweight and obese women follow a diet only for 12 weeks, or follow a diet while following an abdominal resistance training plan for 12 weeks. Multiple measurements were taken before and after the study, including waist and hip circumferences, abdominal skin folds, abdominal subcutaneous fat thickness by way of ultrasonography, and body fat percent through using a bioelectric impedance device. The researchers found that both groups lost similar amounts of weight. However, there was no major difference in any of the variables. In other words, the extra abdominal training had no effect on waist circumference or the amount of subcutaneous fat thickness. In 2022, a meta-analysis was conducted that examined the effect of resistance training on localized fat reduction. A meta-analysis will look at and compare all of the studies on a certain subject to develop a single answer. In this case, it included 13 studies. Once all of the data was taken into account, the meta-analysis concluded that localized muscle training had no effect on localized adipose tissue deposits, i.e. there was no spot reduction, regardless of the characteristics of the population and of the exercise program. Things aren't looking good for spot reduction. In fact, it seems like maybe the naysayers are right. However, all hope isn't lost just yet. Maybe all of the evidence so far has shown no effect simply because they haven't been using the right protocols. This is what a group of researchers in 2023 proposed. The primary observation made regarding spot reduction is that people will use strength training to target the area where weight loss is desired. For example, someone doing Russian twists or crunches. However, it's not the specific exercise people perform, but rather the intensity they use. When the researchers said people traditionally used strength training, they were referring to the fact people used a greater load with fewer reps, in the same way you'd train a muscle when growth was your main goal. However, remember that the theory isn't that spot reduction works by gaining muscle but rather by increasing temperature and blood flow. The researchers wanted to see what would happen if a person used an exercise and performed it in an aerobic fashion. That is, use a light load that can be performed for more than a couple minutes. For example, instead of using heavy dumbbells for bicep curls, maybe you grab a small set of 5-pound dumbbells, or maybe none at all, and perform curls for 3 minutes. In this study, a group of overweight individuals performed 27 minutes of running at 70% of max heart rate. This was then followed with 4x4-minute intervals of torso rotation using 30% to 40% of their 1 repetition max or 1 RM. This is a very light load that can be performed for extended periods of time. One side would train while the other side would rest. Then they performed 4x4-minute intervals at 30% to 40% of 1 RM in the abdominal crunch machine, interspersed with 3-minute active breaks at 20% of 1 RM. In contrast, the control group simply performed treadmill jogging at 70% of max heart rate for 45 minutes. After the study, the researchers discovered some interesting results. After 10 weeks of training, which included 40 training sessions, the aerobic abdominal training group lost more fat mass, 697 grams or 3% in the trunk. In contrast, the jogging-only group had no detectable loss. Why might this occur? Researchers aren't positive, but they believe due to the theory we've mentioned, increasing the temperature along with blood flow. In addition, the researchers suggest another mechanism as well. In the beginning of the video, we mentioned our body will first draw from its glycogen stores to fuel energy. However, when these stores run out, your body will use fat stores to convert into glucose. The researchers believe that the prolonged aerobic training depletes the nearby glycogen stores. In turn, the body mobilizes nearby fat stores to replenish the glycogen stores. However, this actually isn't the first study to use exercises in an aerobic fashion to research spot reduction. A study from 2013 used a similar study design but utilized leg extensions rather than core training to measure fat loss in the thigh. While the results showed a 5.1% decrease in fat, there was no difference in the trained body part compared to the rest of the body. This may be due to the fact that fat stored in the upper body is easier for the body to use for energy compared to the lower body. It also means we still have a lot we don't understand. Another study from 2021 also used endurance exercise but by way of circuit training. 18 volunteers, 9 female and 9 male, aged between 20 and 46 with 1+ year of training were split into 2 groups. Both groups performed a similar set of exercises that used both aerobic and resistance training exercises. However, the order of exercises and timing varied. The control group performed all of the aerobic exercises at the beginning of the session and then performed all of the resistance training exercises at the second part of the session. Further, the resistance training exercises utilized a traditional rep scheme, 1 exercise at a time, with a prescribed number of sets and reps. On the contrary, the experimental group performed a circuit first, rotating between one of 3 aerobic exercises, 5 minutes of either treadmill, bike, or stepper, ab crunches, and dumbbell overhead extension. For example, a participant would perform 5 minutes on the treadmill, then 20 crunches, 15 overhead triceps extension, 5 minutes on the bike, 20 crunches, and so on. It's important to note that the aerobic exercises were done at low intensity and performed at 65% of max HR. Once they finished the circuit, they performed the other resistance exercises in a traditional manner. The researchers found that the experimental group saw a significantly greater loss in the abdominal region, as well as the spinal erector. On the contrary, the traditional training group saw none. In addition, the experimental group also saw a greater loss of body mass. However, no difference was seen in the triceps in either group. The researchers had the same theory about blood flow and concluded the goal of spot reduction training should be to increase blood perfusion in the areas where it is most needed. Further, they cite evidence that suggests blood flow and lipolysis are generally higher in subcutaneous adipose tissue adjacent to contracting than adjacent to resting muscle irrespective of exercise intensity. In other words, both blood flow and lipolysis are greater in areas of fat near a working muscle. Think of it like this. Your body will follow a whole-body approach in terms of the release of fats. However, this release will be greater in those areas in which the release is easier. By performing exercise next to a muscle, you increase blood flow to that area, which will also increase the ability for fats to be released and transported. As of now, all the studies we have spoken about use traditional methods of exercise to study spot reduction. While the variables and methodology are different, they still use basic exercise. Enter technology. There are quite a few studies which suggest that using high-tech equipment changes the game a little bit. In fact, the majority of studies that show spot reduction is plausible in theory involve tech. For example, in 2018, researchers found the electrical stimulation of the abdominals resulted in a moderate reduction in waist circumference. In 2011, low laser therapy was shown to be an effective manner to selectively contour a body shape. And more recently, in 2023, the simultaneous emission of synchronized radio frequency and high-intensity focused electromagnetic energy, that's also the name of the study, was proven to be effective to reduce the size of fat deposits in local areas. Now you're probably thinking, so the only sure way for me to be successful at spot reduction is to go and spend an unknown amount of money on high-tech treatments. If so, let us say that no, we are not suggesting you go spend the money for these treatments. However, this doesn't mean these studies have no value. They do show that we can further influence where fat is released. It's by these studies which may help pave the way for a more practical and efficient method of spot reduction. By having a better understanding of what influences fat release, researchers may be able to produce a better training protocol, supplement, or even a more efficiently priced piece of equipment. If this little bit of research gives a glimmer of hope, how do we go about it? Well, this leaves us where we currently are with spot reduction. While there are studies that show us exercise can induce localized fat loss, the truth is it's lacking. Rather than attempt spot reduction, you may just be better off losing fat the old-fashioned way. Go for a general fat loss approach. However, assuming your spot reduction routine doesn't interrupt your regular training, it's not going to necessarily hurt you. The worst that will happen is you lose fat in a generalized manner, primarily from the extra calories burned during exercise rather than localized. So with this in mind, if you wanted to try and see what happens, this is what we would do. Let's remember that we have two studies that showed some promise. The first used an interval protocol while the other utilized a circuit protocol. Either one will present a practical issue with exercise selection we did not speak about. Let's say you are going to use a machine to perform a 4x4 interval. This means you'll need a machine you can use for 32+ minutes. Or let's say you're going to do a circuit, which will require you to perform an exercise every 5 minutes or so. Again, this requires the ability to have access to a particular machine or equipment for extended periods of time. Unless you have your own gym, taking up a single piece of equipment for this long would be frowned upon in a normal gym setting, limiting your options for exercising. But it can still be done. To hit the arms or back, purchasing a pair of light dumbbells or even resistance bands would work. For example, hitting the back of the arms, a common problem area, could be hit with some banded triceps pushdowns or overhead extensions. The back could be hit with some very light rows. For the core, depending on your strength, the plank may be a good choice, or perhaps Russian twists with no weight. Your goal is to be able to perform the exercise continuously for at least 2 minutes. Now, we saw two protocols, and it's impossible to say which one might be more effective. However, the main idea is to use both aerobic exercise and very low-intensity exercise. There's a countless amount of ways to set this up, but the general idea is the same. For example, you could cycle for 5 minutes, then perform Russian twists or planks for 2 minutes. Repeat for 4 to 6 rounds. One tactic could be to perform this after a regular training session, as your glycogen will already be depleted. Assuming the proposed theory is correct, this is ideal. We're going to be honest. This one surprised us. While spot reduction is often laughed at, it actually seems to not be so crazy of an idea. We have technology that can achieve it, as well as various training protocols specifically for the stomach. The main issue is we simply don't have enough information to be able to provide a definitive answer of doing it. The best we can do is make an informed guess. Regardless if it works, it's still going to be a lengthy process. This means that effective fat loss, either overall loss or spot reduction, is going to require patience and dedication. It's going to be up to you for it to work, so if you're ready to drop some weight, try using the tactics in this video. All in all, the worst that could happen is you lose weight everywhere rather than a specific spot. We can live with that.